Hello, everybody. Earlier this month, we did a show with Michael McFaul, who was the US ambassador to Russia, to post Soviet Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was an interesting conversation. He was talking about his new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. And the more I talked to him, the more it sounded to me as if Russia remained, even if he was an area specialist, a mystery. It brought to mind Churchill's famous definition of Russia, which I think he articulated in 1939, Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Always a tough place to make sense of, perhaps even from the point of view of Russians themselves. Rather than McFaul, we have a Russian, a real Russian on the show today, Mykhail Zygar. He has a new book out this week, The Dark Side of the Earth, Russia's Short-Lived Victory Over Totalitarianism, in some ways covering the same ground as the McFaul book, although much more focused on the Soviet Union and Russia. And I'm thrilled that Mykhail is joining us from Yale, where he is a Yale, from New Haven, where he's a Yale law fellow. Mykhail, why do Westerners, do you think, have such trouble understanding Russia? Is it just because we're a bit dumb?
No, I don't think so, but I actually don't agree with Churchill. I don't think that there is something very specific about Russia. I do think that Russia is like any other country. A lot of problems, a lot of different people, very troubled history, like in many other countries. But Russia as the empire, to my mind, looks like a lot of other different empires. And for example, when I was writing this book about the collapse of Soviet Union, I was thinking that when I write and when I read about the Soviet Union in the 80s, I see a lot of similarities with, for example, the United States today. So I don't think that I think that probably the answer to your question is that a lot of people are trying to solve some kind of riddle, and there is no riddle about Russia. There is nothing specific about the mysterious Russian soul.
Maybe that's the riddle, Mykhail, that there's no riddle. Yeah, and that premise or the thesis that the US now is rather like the Soviet Union as it collapsed is one that we developed a few years ago with Harold James, a historian at Princeton. So it's a theme that's particularly engaging, intriguing, perhaps troubling at the moment. Tell me a little bit about yourself. You're a man who was born in the Soviet Union. What's your history?
I spent almost 10 years working as a war reporter. I was working for Russia's best and high quality independent newspaper, or at least it used to be independent when I worked there, called Kommersant. And I was working in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, Darfur, Uzbekistan, in many places of former Soviet Union. Then I became founding editor-in-chief of Russia's only independent news TV channel. And it was probably the only and the most influential TV channel that sometimes was even called oppositional TV channel. And as you can imagine, it was almost destroyed by Russian authorities back in 2014, just a month before Crimea annexation. Since then, I wrote several books. One of them, probably the most famous one, is called All the Kremlin's Men.
2016.
That's the story of Putin's inner circle, probably the most detailed description of how the Kremlin works, how the inner circle of Vladimir Putin looks like, and probably with some ideas about what can happen after him. And this book, I left Russia almost 3 years ago on the third day of the war in 2022, like a lot of people did. As we know, approximately 1.5 million Russians left the country only in the beginning of 2022, as it was the biggest exodus of Russians since 1917. That was the reaction to the beginning of the war. Since then, I live outside of Russia. I used to be based in Berlin. Then I moved to New York City, and currently I'm in New Haven. And I was sentenced to 8.5 years in absentia for protesting against the war, and basically for writing the book called War and Punishment, which is my previous book, the book about
2023, of course, borrowed from
2023.
the Dostoevsky title. So you began your...
Dostoevsky and Tolstoy at the same time. It's a mixture of War and Peace and Crime and Punishment. Yeah,
that's an ambitious endeavor, Mykhail. You said you began your career as a foreign correspondent. The Polish foreign correspondent Kapuscinski comes to mind. How did you get to be a foreign correspondent? That's a hard thing to become.
I was lucky or unlucky to be studying Arabic in the university. So I studied in Moscow, then in Cairo. And it was the right time to be the specialist in Arab culture and to be the person to work in the Middle East, because it happened right before. I even managed to write the investigation of who is Osama bin Laden and how Al Qaeda works a year ahead of 9/11. So that my knowledge of Arabic brought me there. But at the same time, if you ask about my personal motivations, from today's point of view, I understand that probably the most important reason for me as a young person, I went to the war zone for the first time when I was 21. So probably the real reason for me was my desperate desire to prove anyone that I was not gay. So that was my inner war, which I was fighting for almost till I was 30. So yeah, being an open gay in Russia is a very hard issue. So I was trying to hide and suppress myself till I was 30, and probably that choice, going to war, was a much better and much easier opportunity for me when I was in my 20s.
I know some of the book is, if not autobiographical, certainly you write about your father, who I think was born on the same day as Putin. To what extent is this new book, The Dark Side of the Earth, a history of the last years of the Soviet Union, is it an attempt to understand yourself?
It's important for me because it is a part of my personal story, but mostly it's the story of the country and other people. I start every chapter with a short, just 1 page long story of my family, but mostly it's about other people. Those people who started believing in democracy, and those people who basically, with their beliefs and with their actions, defeated Soviet Union. Because I decided that I had to write this book because we used to think that we know quite a lot about the end of the Cold War and how Soviet Union collapsed and how that chapter of our history ended. But it seems to me that our results were premature, and what we used to consider a happy ending was not the happy ending. And it's clear that the end of history was not the end. And we, although we used to think that the West won in the Cold War and democracy prevailed in the Eastern Bloc, and the Berlin Wall fell and Cold War was over, for now we see that probably Cold War is still going on, and probably some kind of Berlin Wall is still there, and definitely not the democratic opposition prevailed in Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union. Otherwise, we see that Putin today managed to build much worse variant of Soviet Union. The number of political prisoners in Soviet Union is incomparable to the number of political prisoners in Russia right now. I mean, there were dozens back in the 70s and thousands right now. The desire of Russian politicians to threaten the West or to threaten the world with their nukes is incomparable with the same rhetorics of the Soviet leaders. So I think it's very interesting and important to reconsider and to retell the story of that period, because that period shaped what we are having right now, and we have to watch the right people. We do not have to focus only on Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Reagan, and Bush. There were other people who happened to be probably the winners of this situation.
Yeah, so it's anything but, as you say, a happy ending. I know for this book, The Dark Side of the Earth, Russia's short-lived victory over totalitarianism, this history of the last period of the Soviet Union, you interviewed hundreds of people. How do you interview people about the fall of a system, Mykhail? Do you do it as a kind of a data scientist? Do you do it as Dostoevsky or Tolstoy? Do you just ask people to tell stories? Because there's so much to ask. It's such a big canvas.
Yeah, it's true. But usually, as I used to be a newspaper reporter, then I used to be a TV presenter, but now I'm much more privileged because I have enormous amount of time. I'm not in a rush. As a writer, I know that I have to be fully prepared before I write the book. So I ask people to tell their story from the beginning, how it started. And and at the same time, I know that I must know their story even better than they do, because I know that a lot of people are trying to forget. A lot of people are lying sincerely because they believe that it's true. Some people are lying deliberately. For example, I spent a lot of time with Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. He was an amazing personality, very interesting man, but somehow he managed to rewrite his own memories, and he erased some parts from his memories. He tried to think of himself as a freedom fighter, and he was really trying to forget the fact that he used to be a Soviet dictator. And it was, in a way, it was it was really interesting to hear his version. But sometimes you should remember that what people remember is very far from reality.
I don't think Churchill said this, but somebody said about the end of the British Empire is that they lost the empire in a fit of forgetfulness, or something like that. Could one say the same thing about the Soviet Union, that somehow at a moment suddenly everyone forgot what was happening?
Yes, because I think for any empire, religion or ideology is very important. It's really important what people believe in, and if no one believes in the empire, and if they forget why this empire was created and why it is for, that's probably the terrible blow. And definitely Soviet people did not believe in communism since late 60s, probably since 1968, since the Soviet invasion to Czechoslovakia. So Soviet people were probably the most cynical people in the world. Much more cynical are only Russians right now. So Soviet Union was a country of people who chose not to believe in anything. So yeah, I think they forgot that it was very important to believe in something positive.
There's a word for that, Mykhail, nihilism. Of course, it found rather fertile grounds in 19th century Russia. is not believing in anything a form of nihilism, or are nihilists a different category from the Soviet citizens after 68 who simply stopped believing in everything they heard about this system they lived in?
I think it's probably quite the opposite, because Soviet people in the 70s and 80s used the term internal immigration. So they really cared about their private life, about their privacy. They really cared about their inner culture, about their families, about some joy that was officially banned, but that was allowed within the compounds of their tiny apartments. But that was internal immigration. They had to pretend that they still participate in all those Soviet ceremonies, but in reality they didn't care about that. They lived their clandestine, secret lives. That is something which is happening in Russia right now, I think. But Russia right now is slightly different, because Russia finally has become the most capitalist country in the world, and people really care only about money. And you can't call nihilist a person who really cares about money all the time.
I know you interviewed a number of cultural figures, and you consider Soviet culture important. I mean, everyone from Solzhenitsyn to Tarkovsky, they weren't nihilists, or all the great late Soviet writers, filmmakers, poets. What was their role both in the mythology of the Soviet Union and its breakup? I mean, often, especially Westerners, when they think of the Soviet Union, they think of writers and artists and poets and musicians. Shostakovich, of course, also comes to mind. Do they have a particular place in not just Russian culture, but in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of this system?
I think they play a crucial role. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn. He is a particularly spectacular figure, because he came all the way from being the enemy of the Soviet Union, from the person who wrote Gulag Archipelago, who hated Stalin and dreamt of destroying Stalinist communist empire. But somehow, when he was with his evolution and with him being sent to exile after he moved from Soviet Union to the United States, and he spent almost 2 decades in the state of Vermont. He became the fierce enemy of liberal democracy, and he spent years and years criticizing the Western political system, criticizing liberalism. At the same time, his idea was, and he did not conceal that he wanted, in a way, to preserve Soviet Union, but replacing communist ideology with Orthodox Christianity. And it's amazing how influential Solzhenitsyn became, because in a way, what Putin does right now is the attempt to follow that Solzhenitsyn's line. He is trying to somehow create that artificial empire, only with Christian, with Orthodox Christianity to be the key ideology, the platform of his new empire. At the same time, we may hear that sometimes all the criticism of Western liberalism that was written by Solzhenitsyn is becoming more and more popular among American New Right. He is in his criticism of what we now call woke culture. He was probably the first philosopher of that level to start attacking liberal democracy for its weakness. He was writing that unfortunately liberalism prevents the West from having real strong leaders who can unify people and who can defeat all the enemies of the West. So
I
yeah,
think, what do you think Solzhenitsyn would think of you, a gay journalist, a gay Russian journalist exile?
Yeah, I think he would not praise me as as the human being, I guess. But Solzhenitsyn is a very complex figure. It's even now it's very hard for me to digest how he could change so much. For example, when he left Soviet Union and he was traveling all around the world, he came to Spain and he was warning Spanish people that it happened right after Franco's death, and he was warning Spaniards from embracing democracy too early. He was preaching for political stability. So yeah, I think that we are watching Russia from different poles with Solzhenitsyn, and I cannot agree with most of his works. And in that sense, I belong to another camp of Russian intellectuals, the camp whose spiritual leader was Andrei Sakharov, another Nobel Prize winner, legendary physicist, Soviet Oppenheimer, the person who invented the hydrogen bomb and then was terrified by his creature and started his fight against nuclear weapons, against Soviet system, and for human rights.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
And Sakharov was convinced that it's immoral to divide ideas into Western and Eastern. He was 100% sure that any country, Russia including, can and should become democracy.
It's an interesting observation, the two poles of Russian resistance to the Soviet Union, Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn. There were people in the West, Mykhail, who were beginning to suspect that the truth about the Soviet Union was some sort of Russian nationalism, maybe even a Solzhenitsyn-style religious nationalism. We did a show a few months ago with Ed Luce, the Financial Times journalist who's just done a wonderful biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski, of course, was one of the great Soviet observers, worked for Jimmy Carter. So there were people in the West who were beginning to get a sense that the Soviet Union was perhaps more nationalist than communist, weren't there?
Yes and no. Definitely we saw, and I pay a lot of attention to all those first fascists in the Soviet Union, to the infamous Pamyat organization, which was the real fascist party in late Soviet Union. But what's remarkable, that fascist organization could not have even a single member in the parliament of Soviet Union, and it absolutely flopped during the first free and fair parliamentary election in the Soviet Union. Unlike Democrats, and democratic opposition was triumphant. So that it's remarkable that at that moment nationalists were really weak. So I don't think that what we have right now was predetermined. At the same time, yeah, I think that after collapse of Soviet Union, there were different scenarios, and all options were possible. As you probably know, President George Bush Sr. Was highly criticized by American media because he believed that Soviet Union should have been preserved, and his Secretary of State James Baker agreed with him. They thought that Soviet Union transforming into some kind of democratic country, Soviet Union having all the reforms envisioned by Mikhail Gorbachev, would be a more reliable ally, a more reliable partner in that region than disintegrated Soviet Union. And the person who strongly disagreed with him was Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney was convinced that it's better to have 15 little dictatorships instead of one mighty Soviet Union. And it's better to have that destroyed enemy than a huge a huge superpower or former superpower, but like a big country. And I don't think that. So we know that Dick Cheney's approach prevailed, and somehow what we see right now is the tragic consequence of that misunderstanding of Soviet Union. Because I think that in Russia's interest as well in the West's interests were supporting all those democratic forces, maybe providing some kind of Marshall Plan to the Soviet Union to make sure that post Cold War Soviet Union had the possibility to have all the same kind of transformation as Germany had after the Second World War. Unfortunately, Soviet Union was left, or 15 countries that emerged after the collapse of Soviet Union were more or less left on their own, which definitely helped Russian nationalism and helped Vladimir Putin to portray collapse of Soviet Union as the result of Western conspiracy. And actually, he's using conspiracy theories as the platform for his nationalist ideology right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Cheney, of course, just died. A very important legacy you're suggesting.
Yeah.
What most surprised you about your research? As I said, you interviewed hundreds of people for this book. You've revisited the past that you kind of half remember. What did you change your mind about the last days or the last decades of the Soviet Union, which as a consequence of all these interviews and conversations and rethinking the history of the Soviet Union?
Thank you. That's a very important question for me. I'm always mesmerized by the importance of decisions that ordinary people make and how ordinary people can change the world. And sometimes what we see or what we can consider to be the life-changing decision or the logic of history was the accidental consequence of something very very unnoticed by majority. For example, I found out who was the person who defeated the infamous coup of August 1991, which basically became the end of the Soviet Union. As our audience might remember or might not remember, in August of 1991, a group of Soviet heavyweights, most hawkish members of Soviet Politburos, including Minister of Defense, head of KGB, Prime Minister, Vice President, they organized, they staged a coup. They arrested Gorbachev, and they tried to impose the state of emergency in the Soviet Union, which was the attempt to bring back all the totalitarian system. But that coup flopped. It was relevant only for 3 days, and on the third day, democratic forces led by Boris Yeltsin prevailed. But I was really amazed when I realized who was the key person to make that, and that was an ordinary woman. It was a wife of Minister of Defense Dmitry Yazov, whose name was Emma, and she really believed that Russia had a chance to be a democratic country, and she hated the idea of that coup. She hated totalitarianism. So when her husband became the part of that plot, she came to his office and she was crying for 3 days, and she was demanding that he should withdraw all tanks, all troops from Moscow, and he should call Gorbachev and apologize, and he should resign from the junta. And actually, on the third day, he did that. So the failure of the plot somehow was the result of the strong belief of the woman who happened to be the wife of Minister of Defense, and she became stronger than all the army and all the KGB of the Soviet Union.
So in a way, there's a positive message that we do indeed make our own history. Of course, Russia was the canvas where Marx's theories of history were made about historical materialism and the supposed inevitability of history. And a lot of people have commented, I guess, on this transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, suggesting that there was something inevitable about it, maybe even something inevitable about Putin himself. But you're suggesting the reverse.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not believe in predetermination, and I do believe that we matter, and the decisions, the choices we make matter, and we saw that many times in our lives, and that's why I'm not a cynical person, unlike many of my compatriots, and you would be surprised that if I tell you that the most very popular idea in Moscow right now is that the United States is doomed to collapse the same way as Soviet Union collapsed, probably due to the to very similar reasons, because they say most Americans stopped believing in liberal democracy, and without that ideological platform, everything is in vain. I don't think that it's true. I don't think that looking at the election that happened in America 2 weeks ago or last week, I don't think that it's true. I think that cynical political scientists from Russia are too blind, because they don't believe in any values. And I think it's rather premature.
You, as you said, you've spent several years now in the US. You just wrote an interesting piece in the New York Times, an op-ed about Putin, but also about Trump, and then maybe their relationship isn't quite as intimate as some people think. What do you make of the US, Mykhail? You've traveled the world. As you said, you began your career as a foreign correspondent in North Africa. You spent a lot of time in Asia, outside Russia. What country have you been to that's most similar to the US, if it's not the old Soviet Union?
Yeah, I see some similarities between the US today and Soviet Union, as well as I see some similarities between the US and Russia. And speaking about Putin and Trump, and how I see their dynamics, it's pretty amazing that we have come to this situation when Russian leaders are so not interested in any kind of relationships between two countries. It's something unprecedented. We have always seen that Russian leaders, no matter how totalitarian they were or anti-Western they were trying to make friends with their American counterparts. Stalin was really trying to be to be nice to FDR. Khrushchev was trying to make friends with John Kennedy. Leonid Brezhnev, he loved Richard Nixon. They were like they really found each other, and he loved spending time with him. Not to mention Gorbachev, who was really he really respected Ronald Reagan as well as George Bush Sr. And what we have now is Vladimir Putin, who doesn't want any kind of compromise. He doesn't believe that he needs Americans. He doesn't believe that he needs even Donald Trump, because he thinks that he is the most experienced politician in the world, and he's going to be there forever. As you remember, he recently told during a meeting with Xi Jinping that probably he can be immortal if he uses organ transplantation. So, according to his logic, why compromising in any way if in 3 years there might be another president in America? So he's completely uninterested because he believes that sanctions will never work, and he's not dependent on Americans, and that America cannot hurt him any longer.
Yeah, I was looking through your Substack, and there's one photo of at the time, the St. Petersburg, I think the mayor.
Yeah, that's the photo from the book. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
love it.
Anatoly Sobchak and his deputy, who was completely at that point unknown, Vladimir Putin, from 1992. For people who are just listening to this, you can't see the photo, but Putin looks like he's the ultimate schmuck. I mean, I don't know whether the photo is particularly bad or doctored or something, but what's your theory of Putin? There have been so many narratives of this accidental man who keeps on rising and rising and rising. What is your book, your new book, The Dark Side of Earth? As you note, you've already written extensively on Putin. Your 2016 book, All the Kremlin's Men, on Putin, really made you an enemy of the state. They threw you out and all the rest of it. But what does this new book tell you, not so much about Putin, but the inevitability or the lack of inevitability of Putin's rise and rise and rise, this accidental man who, as you say, now believes that he's somehow immortal?
Yeah, he's one of the important characters of this book, because the book covers 30 years of the last Soviet generation, from 1961, the highest moment of Soviet development, the moment when Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut, went to space, till the end in 1991. That's collapse of Soviet Union. So 30 years that Vladimir Putin spent. He was shaped psychologically, morally during all those years, and he was very mediocre, very gray and faceless KGB officer, not Soviet James Bond at all, just a very
not even Goldfinger.
No. He was Mr. No One. He was Mr. Nobody. He was working in as the officer of Soviet foreign intelligence.
He was a man without qualities, literally, wasn't he?
Yes, in Dresden, which you can understand what it means that Soviet spy was working in Dresden, which was GDR, which was like the part of Eastern Bloc. He was not spying; he was spying on Soviet citizens. He was.
Yeah, that's when he was a minor KGB officer in the fall of the war. What was that, in 89 or 90? So
yeah. He was really traumatized by the fall of the war, because he spent in GDR the last 5 years of its existence. He really lost a lot when the war when the wall fell down. He came back and was unemployed in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, but he managed to find a job as the personal assistant of the young and aspiring and promising democratic leader, Anatoly Sobchak. So during the process of the collapse of Soviet Union, Putin was supporting it. He was pretending that he had some kind of democratic values, but really he was the product of his generation. He was absolutely cynical. He knew that there's going to be no bright communist future. He should just try to enjoy his life, and it was better to enjoy it abroad. He was happily he agreed to move to Dresden because that was the possibility to have a better life. And at the same time, he is the representative of the generation which never hoped to be in power, because those people who were running the Soviet Union, that was World War II generation, the generation of Leonid Brezhnev, the people who were clinging to power, and they were not planning to resign anytime before they died. So Putin was in his 30s and 40s, but still those in power were people in their 70s. So actually he remembers that
does he
experience, and he will never
Mikhail,
go
it's
away.
often been remarked that Putin famously says the biggest disaster of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Does he want to recreate it, do you think?
I don't think that he wants to conquer former Soviet republics, but he wants to make Russia some kind of artificial empire with new artificial ideology. And yes, his ultimate goal is to stay in power forever. And for that, he needs to make Russia totalitarian again. He needs to introduce Christian religion, Orthodox Christianity, as the new Soviet ideology. At the same time, he's using Stalin as his saint patron, which is absurd, but he thinks that it is working. So yeah, in a way, he is creating some kind of monster, which is not exactly Soviet Union, but reminds of it.
Finally, let's end where we began. Churchill famously said that Russia's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. You said that's not the case. At the beginning of this conversation, you said that Russia's just like, or the Soviet Union's just like any other system, empire, country. Is then really ultimately, Mikhail, the story of the Soviet Union just another story of the rise and fall of empire from Rome to the Ottomans to the British, maybe even to the Americans?
You know, let me tell you a few sentences of the main plot of the collapse of Soviet Union. There was that old generation that didn't want to resign, and they wanted to stay in power forever. Then there was another young leader who was unlike all of them, who was young and inspiring, and the whole world adored him, and he even won Nobel Peace Prize. And then another person came, and he was much rough, much more aggressive, and he was trying to appeal to those who had never been privileged. He was attacking fake news in mainstream media, and the whole new movement grew around him. And I think that if we read this story in 2025, those two guys remind us of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, but these guys are Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. So that's exactly the story how Soviet Union came to an end. So all historical parallels are lame, but I think that people somehow could be similar. They have their weaknesses, they have their strengths, and I think this book is not only about Soviet Union. It's about a superpower in decline, and it could be very interesting to Americans. Although I do believe that America is not in that danger as Soviet Union was when it was 10 years old. Because I definitely see the difference. But I think that it would be very interesting for many Americans to recognize themselves in those people whom they never thought of their doppelgangers. Many Americans think that there is nothing farther from them than Soviet Union and Soviet people, those ridiculous Soviet people, but sometimes it's not like that.
There you have it. The dark side of the earth, Russia's short-lived victory over totalitarianism. Mykhail Zygar is saying that perhaps Russia is a mirror to the United States. It's not just Russian experts like Mike McFall who should read the new book. It's all Americans. Mykhail, congratulations on the book, and keep doing your brave work in standing up